The heat in Atlanta in August doesn't announce itself the way heat does in other places. It doesn't arrive with thunder or wind or any kind of warning at all. It just settles onto you like a second skin and refuses to leave. And by 4 in the afternoon on a Thursday, the stretch of Bowen Street in southwest Atlanta was the kind of hot that made the asphalt shimmer at the edges and turned the inside of an auto shop into something that felt like the inside of a held breath. Webb's Premier Restorations sat at the corner of Bowen and Clement, a two-bay garage with a hand-painted sign above the roll-up doors that had been repainted twice in 8 years, and still managed to look like it belonged exactly where it was not, because it was fancy, but because it was honest, the kind of place where the floor was clean enough to make you feel slightly guilty about walking on it, where the tools hung on pegboard outlines so precise that a missing wrench announced itself before you even started looking, where the smell of motor oil and metal polish and burnt coffee layered together into something that stopped being individual smells after a while and became simply the smell of the place itself, familiar and specific and not quite like anywhere else. Marcus Dion Webb was at the far end of the second bay working. He was 52 years old and moved like a man who had long ago made his peace with the particular demands of his body. Not slow, not stiff, but deliberate in a way that was different from careful, the way a person moves when every motion has a purpose and none of them are wasted. And he was working on the car that sat in the center of that second bay under two angled shop lights, a 1969 Shelby GT500 in cherry red, primer, no chrome yet, no final coat, just the deep matte red of a car in the middle of becoming what it was going to be. He had been working on this car for 3 years. Not continuously, it wasn't that kind of project. And Marcus wasn't that kind of man. He had a business to run a crew of 3 mechanics who needed management and mentorship, in roughly equal measure, a set of paying customers whose vehicles required his attention and his expertise and sometimes his patience. But the Shelby was always there, always in the second bay, always waiting. And when the day allowed it and the mood was right and the light was good, Marcus came back to it. He was buffing the left front fender panel with a microfiber cloth. Circular motions, consistent pressure, the same motion he had been making for the last 40 minutes. And if you watched him for more than a few seconds, you would notice that this was not the motion of a man trying to finish something. It was the motion of a man who was somewhere else, while his hands did something his hands already knew, and where he was here. The particular Thursday quiet of a shop at the end of its working day, his crew clocking out in 20 minutes, the jazz station on the old Bluetooth speaker in the corner, playing something low and unhurried, the sound of the city outside muffled by the bay walls into something almost pastoral. His daughter Tanya called on Thursdays. He liked to have something in his hands when she called. The phone buzzed in his shirt pocket at 4:47 p.m., and he set the cloth on the workbench and answered it without checking the screen because he already knew. And her voice came through warm and slightly rushed the way it always was when she called from the school parking lot with 15 minutes before her next obligation. "You eating?" she said, before hello the way she always started. "I'm eating," he said. "What did you have for lunch? Food?" "Dad, Tanya." She laughed a short, exasperated sound that was also affectionate. And then she told him that one of her third graders had written a story about a mechanic who fixed a spaceship, and that the mechanic in the story had the same name as her father. And Marcus listened to this with his free hand resting on the fender of the Shelby and his eyes on the middle distance of the bay. And he felt the particular kind of contentment that is not excitement and not happiness exactly, but something quieter and more durable than both the feeling of a man who has done difficult things and survived them, and arrived somehow at a Thursday afternoon in August with his daughter's voice in his ear and a car that needed finishing. "You're never going to finish that car," Tanya said. "It'll be finished," he said. "You've been saying that for 3 years. Good things take time." She said something else he pretended not to hear, and he smiled at the fender, and when the call ended at 4:59 p.m., he put the phone back in his pocket and picked up the cloth and returned to the same panel, the same motion a man in his element in his sanctuary in the life he had chosen and built and intended to keep. The crew clocked out at 5:30. Marcus signed their timesheets at the workbench the way he always did, standing up, not making a production of it, the same few words for each of them, and they filed out through the side door into the cooling afternoon, and the garage became his. Darius was the last one out. He was 19 years old, and he had been working at Webb's for 2 years, and before that he had spent 3 months in the Fulton County Juvenile Detention Center on a charge that Marcus knew the details of because Marcus had read every page of his file before agreeing to the hire. And what Marcus had seen in that file was not a dangerous young man, but a young man who had made a single catastrophic decision in an environment that offered very few good ones. And that distinction mattered to Marcus in a way that was not sentimental, but practical. Darius had the kind of mind that took to mechanical work the way some minds take to music quickly and completely, and with an instinct for it that couldn't be entirely taught. Marcus had not told Darius any of this. He had offered him the job, shown him where the tools were, and corrected his work when it needed correcting, and left it alone when it didn't. And over 2 years, Darius had become quietly indispensable in the way that quiet, capable people always do, and Marcus suspected he knew it, and Marcus was fine with that. "You good, Mr. Webb?" Darius said at the door, which was his way of checking in, the closest he came to expressing the specific gratitude that lived permanently behind his eyes when he looked at this place. "I'm good," Marcus said. "Lock the supply cabinet on your way out. You left it open Tuesday. Sorry, don't be sorry. Lock it." Darius locked it and left, and Marcus listened to the sound of the side door closing, and then to the sound of nothing, which in this shop was not empty but full. The refrigerator in the back office cycling the Bluetooth speakers still going low. The sound of Bowen Street outside settling into early evening. The 2 older men who came most Thursdays, Big Earl and Wendell, had been in around 3 o'clock with their trucks and their coffee, staying longer than any oil change required. Because what they were really there for was the company and the quiet authority of a man who ran a clean shop and didn't talk too much, and was, in the language of this neighborhood, solid in the way that very few people manage to be solid over the long run of a life, and they had left at 4 Big Earl, patting the hood of his Silverado like it had done something good. And then there was Mrs. Loretta Sims, who appeared at 4:15 p.m., the way she appeared every other Thursday, coming through the side door without knocking, because she had long since stopped feeling the need to knock here, carrying a foil-covered plate that smelled of something involving sweet potatoes, and probably pork, 67 years old, and moving with the deliberate authority of a woman who had outlasted every hardship she'd ever met, and intended to outlast several more. "Baby," she said, setting the plate on the workbench near the speaker, which was what she called him, because she had watched him grow from a new business owner on her street into something she didn't entirely have words for, and baby was the word that covered all of it. "Mrs. Sims," he said, "you look tired. I'm fine. You always say that." She looked at the Shelby for a moment the way she always looked at it, not with the eye of someone who understood cars, but with the eye of someone who understood what the car meant, which was different and somehow more accurate. "It's getting there," she said. "It is," Marcus said. She stayed 10 minutes, told him that her nephew Devin, the one who ran the jerk chicken food truck on Piedmont, had gotten a bad health inspection last week that she was certain was not legitimate. And Marcus listened to this without commenting on it, though he had his own thoughts about the inspectors who worked that part of the city, and about Devin's particular run of bad luck with city officials over the last 18 months. He filed it in the part of his mind that filed things to be returned to later. After she left, the shop was his again, and he went to the back office and looked at the floor safe. It was a Browning heavy steel unit bolted through the concrete with 4 industrial anchors he had set himself, and inside it was $280,000 in cash withdrawn from his business account at Georgia Credit Union on Tuesday morning, documented with a withdrawal receipt, an escrow agreement, a signed letter of intent from the seller, and a copy of the certified appraisal. All of it organized in a manila folder that sat beside the stacked bills, because Marcus organized everything because that was how he had always operated, and the habit had not left him when the occupation that trained it did. The money was for the warehouse. The vacant commercial building directly adjacent to the shop had been on the market for 14 months, and Marcus had been in quiet negotiation with the owner for the last 6 of those months, and the closing was set for Monday morning at 9. And what that building would become once the papers were signed and the renovation began was an expansion that would add a paint booth and alignment bay. And this was the part he hadn't told anyone yet except Tanya. A small classroom space in the back where he planned to run a free automotive certification program for young men in the neighborhood who needed a credential and a start, and a place where someone took them seriously. He had not made a speech about this plan to anyone. It was just the next thing the shop was going to be. He checked the safe, confirmed it was locked, and returned to the Shelby, and the jazz station played something he didn't know the name of but recognized, and the evening light through the high bay windows turned the primer red of the car into something that was almost its own light source, and Marcus worked until 6 and then cleaned up and turned off the speaker and the overheads and went to check the secondary camera system before he locked up for the night. 3 years ago, a shop 2 blocks over had been broken into twice in 1 month. The second time, badly enough that the owner had closed temporarily and never really recovered. And after that, Marcus had installed a secondary recording system himself, isolated from the shop's main network. No Wi-Fi, no connectivity, just a dedicated camera unit feeding to an SD card behind the supply shelving, in the back corner of the second bay. A small thing, a precaution, the kind of redundancy that his particular background had trained him to build into everything he did, and he had not thought about it much since the installation because nothing had happened to make him think about it. He confirmed the indicator light was green, which meant it was recording, and he went home. The silver Dodge Charger had been parked half a block south of Bowen and Clement since 3 in the afternoon. Engine off, windows cracked 2 inches against the heat, and inside it, Detective Conrad Pruitt was eating from a bag of cheese crackers and reading a printed surveillance sheet that he had folded twice to fit the space between the steering wheel and his knee. He was 47 years old, heavyset in the way that men get heavyset when they have been large their whole lives and have stopped fighting it with a permanent scowl that had more to do with disposition than circumstance, and a gambling problem that was currently manifesting as a $23,000 hole in his finances that his wife believed was a home equity loan complication, and that was in fact 3 separate sports betting accounts and a casino marker that had come due in September. In the passenger seat, Detective Stuart Vance was not eating anything. He was 44, lean and precise, with the kind of face that gave nothing away because it had been trained not to, and he was watching Webb's premiere restorations through the windshield, with the focused attention of a man who is not really watching the building, but watching the variables around the building, the foot traffic, the sight lines, the exits, the rhythm of the neighborhood at this hour. And he had been doing this for 20 minutes while Pruitt ate crackers and complained about tuition. $1,400 a month. Pruitt was saying not for the first time this week. $1,400. Private school. Stewart, for a kid who just learned to multiply. You know what? $1,400 a month means at end of month. I know what it means, Vance said. It means I'm upside down. It means Teresa is asking questions I don't have answers for. It means I need this to be clean. It'll be clean, Vance said, not looking at him. They had been partners for 6 years, and in that time they had executed 43 civil asset forfeiture seizures under the authority of the Fulton County Narcotics and Gang Interdiction Task Force, which was the official name of a unit that had begun its life as a legitimate law enforcement operation and had become under the informal guidance of Sergeant Earl Dobbs and the practical architecture designed by Vance himself. something closer to a collection agency with badges targeting small business owners, food truck operators, independent contractors, anyone in the working poor to working class corridor of Southwest Atlanta who had accumulated enough cash to be worth the visit, and who lacked the resources or the connections to fight back effectively. The civil forfeiture law was their mechanism under Georgia statute. A law enforcement officer could seize cash and property on the suspicion, not the proof. Not the charge, just the suspicion that it was connected to criminal activity, and the burden of proof to recover. It fell on the owner, who had to navigate a legal process that cost more than most of their seizures were worth, and took years that most of them didn't have. Vance had identified this mechanism 5 years ago with the cold appreciation of a man who recognizes a structural advantage when he sees one, and he had built the unit's operation around it with the same methodical precision that he brought to everything. The paperwork, always technically compliant, the informant network carefully cultivated the targets selected for their vulnerability as much as their assets. He did not think of this as corruption. He thought of it as the natural distribution of resources from people who couldn't defend them to people who understood how the world actually worked. And this belief was so deeply embedded in his character that it had stopped requiring justification the way certain convictions do when they have been held long enough. Pruitt was different. Pruitt knew it was wrong and did it anyway because the debt was real, and the mechanism was available, and the consequences had never materialized in 6 years of doing it. And that combination of pressure and impunity was its own kind of logic. The logic of a man who has made one bad decision and keeps making worse ones to cover it. The intelligence on Marcus Webb had come from Raymond Holt, a loan officer at the Georgia Credit Union branch on Lee Street, who had been on Vance's informant payroll for 2 years, and who had flagged the withdrawal on Tuesday afternoon, $280,000 in cash withdrawn from the account of Webb's Premier Restorations, LLC, with a notation in the withdrawal paperwork referencing a real estate transaction. Vance had pulled Marcus's business license tax filings, property records, and a 3-year transaction history from the credit union within 24 hours. And what he found was consistent and clean, a legitimate business properly filed, steadily profitable. No indicators of criminal activity whatsoever, and this had not deterred him because cleanliness was not the criterion. The criterion was the cash, and the cash was there. And the man who owned it did not on paper have any obvious means of fighting back. He's alone in there now, Pruitt said, watching the last of the crew leave through the side door. I know, Vance said. Monday's a long time to wait. Vance watched the light in the second bay. Marcus's silhouette moving around the Shelby, unhurried, completely unaware of the calculation happening half a block away about his $280,000 and his Monday morning closing, and the 8 years of work he had put into the shop that was about to become the stage for the 44th entry in a ledger that already had 43 names in it. We go tonight, Vance said. At 6:05, Marcus was alone, and the shop was quiet, and the jazz station was playing something slow, and the light in the second bay was doing what it always did at this hour, slanting in from the high windows at an angle that turned everything a slightly warmer color than it actually was, including the primer red of the Shelby, which at this light looked almost finished. Tanya called again at 6:12. She had forgotten to tell him something she said, which was that she had gotten the small classroom grant she had applied for in June, the one from the County Literacy Foundation, and she was using it to buy her third graders a complete set of chapter books, the kind they could own and take home and keep, and she wanted to know if he could come see the classroom sometime next week when she had the books arranged. He told her he would come Tuesday. She told him that was the best thing he'd said all week. He told her the bar was not that high. She laughed, and he stood in the second bay with his free hand resting on the GT 500's fender, listening to his daughter's happiness about a classroom full of books, and he felt the particular kind of satisfaction that has nothing to do with himself, the satisfaction of watching something you helped make become something you couldn't have planned. which was what Tanya had always been from the day she was born until right now, this Thursday evening. 31 years of evidence that the most important thing he had ever done was show up consistently and let her become herself. After the call, he walked the shop. He did this every evening before locking up, not a formal inspection, not a checklist, just the circuit of a man in his space, taking it in, confirming that everything was as it should be, and it usually was because he ran a tight operation, and the crew knew it and performed accordingly. He checked the supply cabinet. Darius had locked it finally, and the oil storage and the tool wall in the first bay, and the refrigerator in the back office, and then he went to the floor safe and crouched and tested the handle, which did not give, and was satisfied. He stood and looked at the framed photograph on the wall above the desk. It was the only military image in the shop, a photograph of 8 men standing in front of a nondescript building in a landscape that could have been anywhere dry and flat and sun-blasted, wearing gear that was not quite standard and not quite identifiable, and the faces of 7 of the 8 men were obscured, blurred in the printing at Marcus's specific request, because 3 of those men still worked in environments where an identifiable photograph was a liability, and the one face that was clear was Marcus's 20 years younger, 30 pounds lighter, with the particular expression of a man who is very tired and very focused, and knows that both of those things are the job. He looked at the photograph for a moment the way he sometimes did, and then he turned off the office light. He was about to check the secondary camera system when he heard the tires. Not parking tires, stopping tires, the specific sound of a vehicle decelerating too quickly and coming to rest at the curb with the kind of abruptness that has purpose behind it. And Marcus stood very still in the doorway of the back office and listened to the sound, and what came up in him was not fear and not panic, but something older and more physical than either of those things. The particular alertness of a man whose body remembers what his life has tried to make him forget, the kind of awareness that does not get trained out of you. No matter how many years you spend in a clean shop in a neighborhood, you chose the awareness that lives in the nervous system, the way certain languages live in the body, quietly, patiently ready. He waited. The side door took 6 seconds to come open. The door came off its frame in the way that Pruitt liked doors to come off frames explosively with the full weight of his boot. Behind it, the splintered wood, and the metal latch scattering across the bay floor with a sound that was designed to do exactly what it did, which was to occupy every available space in the room simultaneously, and leave the person inside it with no mental room for anything except reaction. Pruitt and Vance came through in the practiced formation of men who had done this many times. Pruitt leading Vance flanking right to cut off the secondary exit to the office, both in tactical vests over street clothes, badges on heavy chains, weapons drawn but angled downward, not pointed, not threatening in the technical sense, but present, and declared the way a fist is present before it swings. Marcus was standing in the doorway to the back office, 10 feet from the door they had just kicked in, and he did not move. He did not drop the microfiber cloth in his left hand. He did not raise his hands. He did not step backward or lean away or make any of the involuntary adjustments that people make when the door to their building is suddenly removed and 2 armed men appear in the space where it was. He stood with the cloth in his hand and watched them come in, and his face was completely unreadable in the way that faces are unreadable when the person behind them is not suppressing expression, but simply not generating it because the situation does not yet require expression. It requires attention. His heart rate was 61 beats per minute. In the first 3 seconds, he had noted the black electrical tape over both body camera lenses, 2 strips each applied with the casual precision of a routine act. The way the larger detective's trigger finger was inside the guard rather than alongside the trigger, housing poor discipline, the kind of thing that gets corrected in the first week of firearms training, and stays corrected in people for whom the correction matters. The way the second detective had moved to the right exit with the economy of a man who had planned this entry in advance and was executing a memorized position. and the partial license plate of the silver Charger visible through the gap of the open door, the last 4 digits clear in the bay lights. Fulton County Task Force. Pruitt barked, his voice carrying the artificial urgency of a man performing authority rather than exercising it. "Nobody moves. I'm not moving," Marcus said. His voice was level and entirely without the quality that Pruitt's voice had been designed to produce in it, which was fear. Pruitt registered this and pushed through it the way he always pushed through early non-compliance, by escalating the performance. He stepped forward, badge swinging on its chain, using the combined mass of his body and his authority to occupy Marcus's personal space in the way that worked with almost everyone, the way that said without words, "I am larger than this situation, and you are inside it." Marcus watched him come. "Hands where I can see them, Webb," Vance said from the right, his voice flat and specific in the way of a man who has no interest in theater. Marcus raised his hand slowly to chest height, palms opened the cloth still in his left hand, and the motion was so unhurried and so precise that Pruitt, who had been ready for resistance, had to recalibrate, and the half-second of recalibration was itself a piece of information. "We have a warrant," Pruitt said, producing a folded document from his vest pocket and holding it in the general direction of Marcus's face without extending it close enough to be read. "Anonymous tip that this facility is being used to process narcotics proceeds for the East Side Network. We're searching the premises." "That's quite a story," Marcus said. Pruitt's scowl deepened. He stepped closer, which is what he did when people talked back, which was most people eventually. "Cut the commentary," he said. "We know about the safe. We know about the cash. Open it, or I bring in a breaching team and we start with the vehicles." Marcus looked at him for a moment, the specific look of a man assessing the full weight of a situation before deciding how to respond to it, not hostile, not afraid, just thorough, and then he said, "I'll open the safe. There's no need to damage the vehicles." And in that moment, behind his unreadable face, Marcus Dion Webb made a decision. He could end this in the next 60 seconds if he chose to one phone call 3 words, and the men in front of him would understand exactly what they had walked into, and would be spending the next several hours trying to walk out of it. He had the number. He had the authority. He had everything necessary to bring this particular operation to a halt before it went any further. He did not make the call, because Devin Sims, Mrs. Loretta Sims's nephew, the young man with the jerk chicken truck on Piedmont, had lost $34,000 to these men, or men very much like them, 14 months ago, and Devin had not had a phone call to make, and Devin had not had a number to dial, and Devin had spent 4 months navigating a civil recovery process that cost him more in attorney fees than he recovered, and ended with his truck sitting idle for 3 weeks, while he figured out how to make his November rent. And if Marcus revealed himself right now, these 2 detectives would get spooked and lawyered up, and the unit would survive, and next month there would be another Devin Sims who did not have what Marcus had, and the month after that there would be another one. The only way to protect the next person on their list was to let the rope play out until it was long enough to be useful. "Follow me," Marcus said, and led them to the back office. The back office was 8 by 10 feet of cinder block, and purpose a battered oak desk that had been in this building when Marcus bought it, and that he had refinished himself in the first spring, a filing cabinet, a single overhead fluorescent, the framed photograph on the wall above the desk, and on the floor in the far corner behind the desk, flush with the concrete, the Browning safe. Pruitt filled most of the room just by being in it. Vance positioned himself near the door with his weapon holstered now, one hand resting near the grip, his eyes moving around the office with the patient cataloging of a man who has learned to read rooms, the filing cabinet, the desk surface, the photograph, and when his eyes touched the photograph he paused on it for less than a second, noted the group of men in gear with the obscured faces, and filed it without apparent significance. Marcus knelt at the safe and dialed the combination, 12, left 3, right 7 left. The tumblers engaging with the heavy precision of a quality lock, and he pulled the door open and straightened up and stepped back, which gave Pruitt the clear view he needed, and which Marcus had timed precisely because giving Pruitt what he wanted was right now the correct tactic. The stacks of hundreds in bank straps were exactly what they had come for, and when Pruitt saw them, the transformation in his face was involuntary and complete. The professional severity that had been his operating expression dissolved briefly into something naked and relieved. The look of a man for whom $280,000 in a floor safe is not a criminal investigation, but a solution to a problem that has been keeping him awake for 3 months. That money is the capital for a commercial real estate acquisition, Marcus said, watching Pruitt reach into the safe. The documentation is there on the desk: the bank withdrawal receipt, the escrow agreement, the letter of intent from the seller, the appraisal. All of it, dated all of it, notarized. Vance moved to the desk and looked at the folder without picking it up. The way you look at evidence you have already decided is inadmissible. Drug proceeds move through banks and through escrow accounts. Webb, he said, his voice carrying the precise flatness of a man reciting a line he has used many times, in many offices, over many desks covered with many folders of legitimate documentation. If the money is clean, you petition the county. The process takes about 3 years. I'd get a lawyer. Pruitt was dumping the stacks into a heavy canvas duffel with the focused efficiency of a man aware of time. And when the last stack was in, he zipped the bag and shrugged it onto his shoulder and pulled a blank seizure receipt from his vest pocket and signed it with a scrawl so rapid it was not a signature but an event, and he dropped it on the desk with the particular contempt of someone depositing a tip they don't mean. "Have a good weekend," Pruitt said. "Don't leave town." They moved backward out of the office, keeping Marcus in their sightlines the way professionals do even when they are not technically professionals, and Marcus stood in the doorway and watched them go without following. And when they reached the bay floor and turned and walked toward the kicked-in door, he said, without raising his voice, one sentence: "You should know that this shop has eyes you haven't found." Vance stopped for exactly half a second. Pruitt laughed, the specific laugh of a man who needs to believe something is funny because the alternative is that it isn't. And then they were through the bay and out into the Atlanta evening, and the Charger's engine turned over, and the tires squealed on the asphalt, and the sound faded south toward the connector, and Marcus stood in the doorway of his office in the quiet of the shop and listened to it go. Then he walked to the supply shelving in the back corner of the second bay and removed the SD card from the secondary camera unit and carried it to his desk. He watched the footage once beginning to end without stopping it. The camera's angle was good. It covered the entry point, both bays and the doorway to the back office, and the audio was clear enough to carry individual words without distortion. And what the recording showed was 47 minutes of evidence that was in the language Marcus still thought in, even 8 years removed from the work. It came from clean and complete and actionable faces, voices, badge numbers, readable on the chains, the partial plate of the Charger through the open door. The moment Pruitt signed the blank receipt with a scrawl that would not hold up as a legitimate signature in any court proceeding, the moment Vance looked directly at the escrow documentation and dismissed it. The taped camera lenses captured in the first seconds when Pruitt moved through the light at the right angle. Marcus ejected the card when the footage ended and sat for a moment at the desk. He did not call 911 because calling local police to report 2 local detectives from the same department on a Friday evening was a process he understood well enough to know its outcome, which was not the outcome he needed. He did not call a lawyer because a lawyer would contain the problem and serve Marcus's immediate interests, and Marcus's immediate interests were not. Right now, the priority Devin Sims's interests were, and the interests of the other people in this neighborhood who had been on the receiving end of whatever Pruitt and Vance and their unit had been doing long enough to have a rhythm to it, long enough that the informant at the credit union knew to call them when a withdrawal happened on a Tuesday afternoon. He opened the contacts on his encrypted phone and scrolled to a name that appeared simply as R.C. He had not dialed this number in 4 years. he had never deleted it. He sat for a moment, looking at the contact, and then he looked through the office doorway at the GT500 in the second bay primer, red under the shop fluorescence, patient and unfinished, and then at the framed photograph on the wall above his desk, the 7 obscured faces, and his own younger face, and then he dialed. The line connected after 2 rings, routing through what Marcus knew to be a series of relay points that would have required specialized equipment to trace, and a voice came through that was gruff and familiar, and carried the specific warmth of a man who is glad to hear from someone he has trusted in circumstances that most people are fortunate never to encounter. "Well," Ray Cole said, "I thought you were dead or retired to Florida." Neither Marcus said. "What do you need, boss?" Marcus laid it out in 6 sentences. The detectives, the unit, the 47 minutes of footage, the $280,000 the Monday closing, that was no longer going to happen as planned, the blank seizure receipt on his desk. Cole listened without interrupting, and when Marcus finished there was a pause that was not silence, but the specific quality of a mind reorganizing its priorities. And then Cole said, "They hit you. They actually walked into your shop and stole from you." "They did," Marcus said. "These boys just strap themselves to something they don't understand and don't know." "The fuse is lit," Cole said. "Give me 2 hours. I'll give you the shape of everything they've built." Before Marcus hung up, Cole said, "You know what you're asking for." And Marcus said, "I know what they've already done to people who couldn't ask." He closed the phone and he went back to the Shelby because the fenders still needed work, and some things don't stop just because other things have started, and he buffed the primer with the microfiber cloth in the same slow circles he had been making since 4 in the afternoon, in the quiet of the shop that he had built from a VA loan, and 8 years of mornings that started before the crew arrived, and the jazz station played, and the light outside went from purple to black, and Marcus worked until there was nothing left in the motion that wasn't peace. The bar was in Buckhead, the kind of place where the leather booths were deep enough to have privacy, and the bourbon list ran to 2 pages, and the air smelled of expensive tobacco, and the specific kind of satisfaction that comes from spending money you didn't earn on things you don't deserve. And at 9:15 on that Thursday evening, Pruitt and Vance were in the corner booth with their drinks, and Pruitt was doing the thing he always did after a score, which was talk. "I'm telling you," Pruitt said, swirling the bourbon in a way that suggested he had watched someone do this in a movie and decided it was the right gesture for the moment. "Easiest one we've done this year." The guy didn't even ask for a lawyer, didn't even flinch, just opened the safe and stepped back. The duffel was in the trunk of Pruitt's Charger in the bar's parking garage, and it was $55,000 lighter than it had been when they left Webb's Premier Restorations, because Vance had counted the full amount in the car on the way here, and they had put $55,000 in a separate bag that was going to a secondary location before the rest was logged into the unit evidence system at midnight, which was when Dobbs would be there to facilitate the intake and receive his cut, which was the arrangement that had been in place for 4 years, and which had never produced a complication that couldn't be managed. Dobbs got 15% of the skim. It had never been written down. 62 and 23 this month. Pruitt continued referring to what the 2 seizures had netted him personally. "I can cover September and get ahead on October. Teresa's going to stop asking questions." He leaned back in the booth with the specific relaxation of a man whose debt anxiety has temporarily released its grip, which was the only relaxation Pruitt was capable of the brief interval between the pressure and the next one. Vance was not relaxed. He was staring at his glass. He had been quieter than usual since they left Bowen Street, and the quietness was not the comfortable quietness of a satisfied man, but the particular quietness of a man whose analytical mind has snagged on something that won't release. He wasn't scared, Vance said. Pruitt looked at him. "What?" "Webb." He wasn't scared. Vance set his glass down and turned it once on the coaster a precise quarter rotation. When we came through the door, most people, even prepared people, have a physical response. Pupils, posture, breathing. He had none of that. He watched us come in, and he looked at us the way a person looks at something they're trying to understand. People freeze, Pruitt said. You know that. Shock looks like calm. Not that kind of calm, Vance said. When I went for the secondary exit, he'd already clocked me. He was already adjusting, and when you got in his face, normal people lean back. He didn't move. He just looked at you. He's a mechanic, Stewart. Maybe, Vance said, and pulled out his phone. But I want to run him. Full background, federal level. I want to make sure this man doesn't have a federal judge in his family or a connection to somebody we don't want connections to. Pruitt waved his hand. You're overthinking it. We have the badge. We have the unit. We've done this 43 times. I know how many times we've done it, Vance said flatly, and logged into the NCIC database through his secure mobile terminal. He typed Marcus Dion Webb, date of birth, social security number. The screen ran its usual quick search and then did something that Vance had not seen it do in 6 years of running names on this terminal. It ran slow, 5 seconds, then 10. Then the application's background turned the specific shade of red that indicated not a search result, but an access denial, and in the center of the red screen a bold text box appeared. Restricted. File Department of Defense clearance. Tier 1. Required. This inquiry has been logged. Cease immediately. The cigar nearly fell from Vance's fingers. He looked at the screen for 3 full seconds, processing what it meant, not just the block, but the logged inquiry, which meant that somewhere in a federal system a record now existed. That Stewart Vance of the Fulton County Task Force had attempted to access the file of Marcus Dion Webb and had been denied, which meant that someone with the authority to monitor that kind of inquiry had potentially been notified of it within the hour. He turned the phone toward Pruitt. Pruitt read it. The celebration left his face like air from a punctured tire all at once, completely leaving behind the pallor of a man who has just been handed information he does not want and cannot return. State PD doesn't get DOD blocks, Vance said quietly. The FBI gets DOD blocks sometimes. Tier 1 is Special Operations. Delta, DevGru, CIA, Special Activities. That's what Tier 1 means. He paused, and the inquiry was logged, which means the moment I ran his name, someone somewhere received a notification. Pruitt stared at the phone. What the hell did we just steal from? He said. At 2:47 in the morning, Pruitt's house in the Windhaven development in Marietta, a gated community of 4-bedroom colonials with 2-car garages and HOA fees that were paid in Pruitt's case with money that had passed through several layers of informal accounting before it arrived in his checking account, was dark and silent, in the way that suburban developments are dark and silent after midnight, which is completely as if sound itself respects the property values. The home security system was a monitored ADT unit with motion sensors on the first floor door, contacts on all exterior entries, and a keypad in the hallway that beeped softly when the code was entered and then confirmed the arm or disarm status with the second lower tone. Pruitt woke to the second tone. Not the alarm, not the shriek of a breach, just the quiet confirmation beep of a system that had been voluntarily disarmed by someone who knew the code, and Pruitt was out of bed and across the room with his Glock 19 in his hand before his eyes were fully adjusted, because 6 years of doing what he did had built into him a reflexive response to unexpected sounds that was faster than thought. He swept the upper floor, first methodical room by room, closets open, nothing. Then came down the stairs with the weapon raised and his breathing controlled. And the specific terror of a man in his own house who is trying very hard not to fully understand what the absence of an intruder means, in combination with the disarmed alarm and the fact that all the doors were locked from the inside. In the kitchen, in the center of the granite island, standing upright on its base with the precise balance of something placed there, deliberately, was a single, unfired 5.56 millimeter NATO rifle cartridge. and beneath it, folded into a 2-inch square, a piece of white paper. Pruitt stared at the round for a full 10 seconds before he reached for the paper, and when he unfolded it, the block lettering was so clean and precise that it looked printed rather than handwritten, and there were 4 words, "I want it back." He took a photograph of the note and called Vance without putting the gun down. At the same moment, across the city in a high-rise condominium in Midtown, Vance was sitting at his laptop in the specific panic of a man watching his financial architecture collapse in real time. He had decided, after the cigar lounge, that the DOD block meant he needed to move his hidden assets immediately, $387,000 in a Cayman Islands account that existed under a shell company name that had taken him 8 months to properly obscure, and he was in the process of routing the funds into decentralized cryptocurrency wallets that would break the trail into irretrievable fragments when he clicked the transfer and watched the screen refresh. The balance read $387,000. He clicked refresh. It read $387,000. He initiated the transfer. The screen refreshed. It read 0. The transaction history showed a single outgoing wire executed 14 seconds ago, routed through 11 intermediary accounts, in a sequence that Vance recognized with the sick clarity of someone who understands financial obfuscation at a professional level as infrastructure, not an individual's work, but an operations work, the kind of routing that requires systems and access and coordination that no mechanic on Bowen Street assembles on a Thursday night. The memo line on the wire read, "Restitution 1 of 2. His phone rang. Restricted number. He answered it and heard no voice heard, instead the sound of a combination dial being turned on a heavy floor safe. The specific clicking of tumblers engaging in sequence click, click, click 3 times, and then Marcus Webb's voice completely unhurried, carrying none of the urgency of a man who has just committed a federal wire transfer, and none of the anger of a man whose $280,000 was taken from him 5 hours ago. Just a voice making an observation. "You really should have checked my references, Stewart." The line went dead. Vance sat in the dark of his condominium for a long time, and when Pruitt called 30 seconds later, he answered and listened to the story of the disarmed alarm and the rifle cartridge and the 4-word note, and when Pruitt finished, Vance said, "Don't go back to sleep. Meet me in an hour, the strip mall on Candler." He put the phone down and looked at his zero balance account. The man he had dismissed as a mechanic had wiped $387,000 from a Cayman account in 14 seconds, and walked through a monitored alarm system and left a rifle cartridge on the kitchen island of a detective's house and locked the door on his way out, and all of it had happened in the 5 hours since they kicked in his door. And Vance, for the first time in 6 years of operating with the confidence of a man who has never faced a consequence, understood that he was dealing with something he had not accounted for. The strip mall on Candler Road had been half vacant for 3 years, and the security cameras on the remaining businesses had been non-functional since the previous winter, which was why Pruitt had chosen it as an emergency meeting point 18 months ago, when they needed somewhere to talk. That wasn't a bar or a precinct or either of their houses, and it was still the right choice in the sense that no one was watching. Except that Pruitt did not know about the camera Marcus had attached to the utility pole at the lot's north entrance 4 hours earlier, or about the microphone relay that Cole had activated through their cell phones, turning the devices in their pockets into live audio feeds that were currently routing through 3 countries and into the ruggedized tablet in the back of a black SUV parked in an office complex 2 miles away. The rain had started around 3 and was coming down seriously now, and both men were damp and strung with the specific edginess of people who have not slept and are aware that their situation has changed in ways they do not yet fully understand. Pruitt's hands were still not entirely steady. He bypassed the ADT Pruitt said for the second time since they'd gotten in the car. A monitored system. Bypassed it without triggering the alert to the monitoring center. And then He locked everything on his way out. From the inside. I know, Vance said. He left a rifle cartridge Stewart. 5.56. That's military caliber. I know what caliber it is, Vance said. He was leaning against the passenger door with his arms crossed, his eyes moving around the dark parking lot, with the residual professional habit of a man who checks his perimeter even when he knows nothing is there, except that something was there, and he did not know it. The Cayman account is gone. $387,000, routed through 11 intermediaries in 14 seconds. I've had forensic accountants who couldn't do that in an afternoon. He paused. And the DOD block. Logged. Which means the moment I ran his name, someone was notified. That was last night. So, we go back, Pruitt said. Tonight, we go to the shop, we plant product, we arrest him. If it goes wrong, we stop, Vance said. I'm just saying. He walked through your alarm system, Conrad. He moved almost $400,000 in 14 seconds. He knew my name when he called me, knew it specifically, not the other detective, my name, which I never gave him. Vance turned to look at Pruitt directly, which he rarely did. He is watching us right now. I would bet everything I have left on that. In the SUV 2 miles away, Marcus said nothing. He was watching the GPS dot on the tablet that corresponded to the tracker he had placed on Pruitt's charger, while Pruitt was inside the evidence building 3 hours ago. And through the audio relay in his earpiece he could hear both men with sufficient clarity to follow the conversation, word for word. And what he was hearing was exactly what he had expected to hear. Two men who have been operating with impunity for long enough to build a false confidence, now processing the experience of encountering something their false confidence had not prepared them for, and arriving inevitably at the decision that corrupt men always arrive at when they feel the ground shifting. They would move to protect their largest asset, the storage unit Vance said in the car on Candler Road. We need to move the inventory. If he can find offshore accounts, he can find a storage facility. Call Dobbs, Pruitt said. We need him there. Calling Dobbs already, Vance said. In the SUV, Marcus keyed his earpiece quietly. Ray, they're moving to Route 85. Get Torres on the line. Green light on Phase 2. Cole's voice came back immediate and steady. Copy that, Commander. Moving now. Marcus put the SUV in drive. The two detectives in the parking lot on Candler Road believed they were taking action. Believed they were exercising the last available control in a situation that had slipped. And Marcus understood that belief because he had spent 20 years studying the decision-making of people under pressure. And the consistent finding was this: when you apply the right kind of pressure to the right kind of people, at the right moment they don't fight back. They run to their treasure, and their treasure leads you to everything else. He turned out of the office complex and headed for Route 85. He was born in Macon, Georgia, in the summer of 1971. The second child of Dorothy Webb, who worked the morning shift at a textile plant, and the evening shift at a dry cleaner's, and the occasional weekend shift at a diner on Mulberry Street, and who never once in Marcus's memory of his childhood complained about the weight of what she was carrying, which was a large and heavy weight by any reasonable accounting. 2 children. No husband after Marcus turned 9, a 2-bedroom house that required more repairs than the budget allowed, and the specific daily labor of loving people in conditions that made love difficult to sustain. His father left without a scene which was, Marcus had come to understand as an adult. Its own kind of damage, not the dramatic damage of a loud departure, but the slow, low-grade damage of an absence that never quite explained itself, that left a shape in the house that couldn't be named or addressed or recovered from in any direct way. Dorothy Webb's answer to this, and to most of the other problems her life presented, was work and directness, and the expectation that her children would find their own way through the world, and that finding it would require them to be honest about what it actually was. Marcus enlisted at 19 in 1990 at the recruiter's office on Cherry Street in Macon, because the alternatives available to him in that time and place were limited in ways that people who grew up elsewhere in different circumstances sometimes find difficult to understand, and because his mother had made it clear without drama that whatever he did with his life, she expected it to be something, and the Army was a path to something, a structure, a discipline, a direction that he could see and commit to even if he couldn't entirely predict where it would lead. It led further than he could have predicted. The 75th Ranger Regiment came first, where he learned what discipline actually cost a body, and what a unit of men who trusted each other completely was capable of, which was considerably more than he had understood before. And then the Special Forces assessment and selection process, where the evaluators identified in him something that the infantry had used but not fully recognized, which was not physical ability but analytical patience, the ability to hold a situation in his mind at multiple levels simultaneously, and to wait for the right point of intervention rather than forcing the first one available. Delta came in 1997. What he did there between 1997 and 2011 does not appear in any public record, and Marcus has never described it in any setting where the description could be quoted back to him, and the 14 years of it exist only in the classified files that carry his name and in the specific ways his body and mind were shaped by the work which are visible to anyone trained to look but invisible to everyone else. What can be said is that he was good at it, not the violence which he was capable of, and did not flinch from, but did not seek but the architecture of it. The operational thinking, the ability to design a situation so precisely that the outcome was determined before the first action was taken, and that this particular skill, the skill of building a trap so well designed that the target walks into it without understanding until the last moment that they have been moving toward it all along, was the skill that had defined his career, and that had never in the 8 years since his retirement been used in the way it was designed to be used. He had used it for cars, mostly the diagnostic thinking required to understand why an engine is misbehaving, the patient methodical reasoning that takes a symptom and works backward to its source, and for the shop which he had built from a nearly empty garage into a functioning small business through the same process of planning and adjustment and patience that he had applied to operations in countries whose names he still didn't say in casual conversation. He had left because of Clara. Clara Webb had been diagnosed with ovarian cancer in the fall of 2014, and Marcus had submitted his retirement paperwork within the week. No deliberation, no extended consideration, because the decision was not difficult. It was simply the identification of what mattered most and the movement toward it, which was what Marcus did in every situation where the stakes were clear. She died 14 months after his retirement in January 2016, during a winter that Marcus remembered as the longest of his life, and the GT500 in cherry red primer was the project she had suggested in the last good months, when she could still sit in the second bay and watch him work and tell him what the car needed, which was the chrome and the final coat and the particular color she had picked from a swatch book at the paint shop on Decatur Street. She had called it Candy Apple Red. He had not put it on yet. He was still working toward it. Now, sitting in the SUV in the office complex parking lot with the tablet open and the GPS dot moving on the Route 85 map and Ray Cole in his earpiece. Marcus was not thinking about any of this. He was thinking about the storage unit layout that Cole had confirmed from the financial records, about the position of the exterior cameras, about the timing of Torres's team staging, about the specific sequence of events that needed to occur in a specific order to produce the outcome he intended, and his mind moved through the operational variables with the ease of a man using a skill that had never actually left him. The way a language you learned at 20 is still in you at 50, present and complete, waiting to be spoken. Ray Cole was 58 years old and had spent 22 years as the intelligence chief for Delta's operations division before transitioning to a role as a senior civilian contractor for the Department of Defense. which was a euphemistic way of describing a position that gave him access to intelligence infrastructure that most government employees at his pay grade could not have named, let alone used, and which he deployed on behalf of the defense establishment and occasionally on behalf of Marcus Webb, because Cole had been in enough rooms with Marcus in enough bad situations to have a specific, durable trust in Marcus's judgment that he did not extend to many people. He had told Marcus in the first call that he would need 2 hours. He had called back in 90 minutes. What he had assembled in those 90 minutes full financial profiles on Pruitt and Vance and Dobbs, including the offshore structures Vance had spent 8 months building the payment patterns that corresponded to 43 seizure dates over 4 years, the real estate transactions that couldn't be reconciled with their combined legitimate salaries, and the burner phone records that showed a 14-month pattern of contact with a cartel intermediary, whose payments to Dobbs had been crossing paths with the unit's seized asset inventory. He had also flagged Marcus's NCIC query. The query had been logged at 9:47 p.m., and at 9:48 p.m., a notification had reached a DoD counterintelligence monitoring desk, which was standard protocol for Tier 1 file access attempts, and the desk officer on duty had forwarded the notification to a list of contacts that included at Position 7 an FBI Public Corruption Task Force operating out of the Atlanta field office because that task force had, 22 months earlier, run an inquiry on Marcus Webb's background as part of a background check on a potential cooperating witness, and the system had maintained the connection. That was how Special Agent Diana Torres had known within 40 minutes of Vance running Marcus's name that something had happened on Bowen Street. Torres had called Marcus directly at 10:55 p.m. after a brief conversation with Cole that established the connection, and Marcus had answered and listened to her introduce herself, and then asked her 3 questions in sequence before she got to her own agenda. The first was she aware that the unit had operated this way for more than 2 years. Yes, she said. 22 months of documented case building. The second, did she have enough to take down the full unit without the events of tonight? No, she said. She had RICO predicate financial records and one scared cooperating witness who might or might not hold up under pressure. She needed an active, documented, unambiguous seizure event involving a victim with the standing and the resources to participate in a federal prosecution. The third were the other victims, specifically Devin Sims, whose food truck savings had been taken 14 months earlier, and the other Bowen Street businesses Marcus could identify included in the recovery provisions of the case she was building. Yes, she said. All documented victims. Every dollar that could be traced. Marcus had agreed. What Torres told him next changed the shape of what had already happened. The $280,000 in his floor safe had been without his knowledge, at the time, FBI serialized bait money registered 2 months earlier in an arrangement Torres had made with the Georgia Credit Union. In anticipation of exactly this kind of seizure attempt, she had identified the credit union informant, identified the unit's targeting methodology, and arranged for the cash in Marcus's account to carry serial numbers logged in federal evidence records waiting for the moment Pruitt and Vance made their move. Marcus had sat with this information for a moment. Then he said, "So you've been waiting for someone on this street they'd go after." Torres said, "We needed a target they couldn't resist." Marcus said, "You got one." Torres said, "I'm sorry it was you." Marcus said, "Don't be. Make sure it counts for Devin Sims." "It will," Torres said. Between midnight and 4 in the morning, Marcus worked. The GPS tracker under Pruitt's charger had been placed at 11:15 in the 30-minute window, while Pruitt was inside the evidence building on Pryor Street, logging the $225,000 Marcus had simply pulled up behind the building, parked on the service road, walked to Pruitt's car in the lot, crouched for 8 seconds and left. The phone intercepts that Cole had activated were running through a DoD counterintelligence provision that covered former Tier 1 operators whose financial security had been compromised by criminal action under color of federal or state authority, a narrow provision used rarely but real and documented, and Cole had invoked it within an hour of Marcus's first call. The laptop in Unit 402 of Apex Secure Storage on Route 85. Marcus had identified the facility 3 weeks ago when Cole's first pass at the unit's financial records had suggested a storage arrangement in the Route 85 industrial corridor, and Torres had confirmed the specific unit number through a financial subpoena that had come back the previous week. Marcus had rented the adjacent unit under a shell name Torres provided, and he had placed the laptop and the camera above the door at 2:15 in the morning, after Torres's team had already emptied Unit 402 of its contents, $2.9 million in cash, and seized assets transferred to federal custody in an armored transport that had rolled quietly out of the facility at 1:45. The laptop on the folding chair was not a threat. It was a mirror. It was going to show 3 men the room they thought they were saving and tell them what had already happened to it and what had already happened to them. And Marcus wanted them to understand, not just to be arrested, but to understand, because men who are arrested without understanding what caught them remain in their own minds unlucky rather than wrong. And the difference between unlucky and wrong matters enormously when it comes to what happens afterward. At 3:15, sitting in the SUV, watching the GPS, Marcus took out his phone and looked at the last text from Tanya. "Love you, Dad. Don't stay up too late." She had sent it at 9 p.m. before any of this, when Thursday was still just Thursday, and Marcus was still just a mechanic, and the world was simpler than it currently was. He didn't reply. She was asleep, and the reply could wait for morning. And the morning was coming, but he held the phone for a moment and thought about his daughter's classroom and the new books arriving next week and the third graders who were going to own them, and then he put the phone away. Torres called at 3:40. Team is staged at Edgewood. Waiting on your word. Marcus watched the GPS dot. "Give them 30 minutes, he said. "I want Dobbs inside the building before the team moves," confirmed, Torres said. At 4:07, the dot began moving Pruitt's Charger, pulling out of the Windhaven development, heading east toward Route 85. Marcus set down his coffee. Earl Dobbs was 55 years old and had been a sergeant in the Fulton County Task Force structure for 11 years, and what those 11 years had made him was comfortable, not wealthy, not ambitious, not particularly happy, but comfortable in the specific way of a man who has arranged his life to require as little from himself as possible, and has largely succeeded. His house was a well-maintained ranch in Decatur with a covered patio and a Weber grill he used on Sundays, and a wife named Barbara, who taught elementary school, and who believed with the uncomplicated faith of a woman who had no reason to examine it, that her husband's moderate prosperity was the product of his moderate career. And Dobbs had constructed their life together carefully enough over the years that nothing visible contradicted this belief. He had not sought the corruption. This was the thing about Dobbs that made him in some ways the hardest to account for. He had not been greedy in the beginning, had not been contemptuous. Like Vance or desperate like Pruitt, he had simply been offered a percentage of a cash stream that already existed, offered it by a man he worked with and trusted, offered it in language that framed it as the unit's operational reality rather than an individual choice. And he had said yes because saying no would have required a kind of courage that Dobbs had never in 55 years demonstrated in any situation where the comfortable option was available. 4 years of saying yes had made him an accessory to 43 crimes. He knew this in the same way people know things they have decided not to look at directly, and the knowing sat in him like a stone that he had learned to carry without acknowledging its weight. Vance's call came at 4:12, and Dobbs listened to it sitting on the edge of his bed in the dark with Barbara breathing steadily beside him. And what Vance told him, the DOD block. The Cayman wiped the rifle cartridge. The 4-word note, the moving of the inventory, produced in Dobbs the first truly unmanageable fear he had felt in 4 years. which was the fear of the cartel contacts. The $2.9 million in Unit 402 included funds skimmed from seizures of cartel-adjacent cash, and those funds carried an expectation of kickback payments that Dobbs had been managing through Vance's cartel intermediary for 14 months. And if the money moved, and something went wrong, and the payments stopped, the people who were owed those payments would look for them. And Dobbs knew, without needing to be told, what that looked like. "I'll be there," he told Vance. He got dressed in the dark with the particular care of a man who is aware this might be the last normal morning routine he performs for a long time, and he looked at the framed photograph on the dresser as he buttoned his shirt. His police academy graduation 30 years ago, a young man in a dress uniform with an expression of sincere intention, and he thought briefly about what that young man had intended, and then he picked up his keys and went out to his car. Apex Secure Storage on Route 85 was the kind of facility that asked very few questions of its clients, which was by design. The rates were slightly above market. The security was legitimate, the privacy was emphatic, and the client base included a range of people whose reasons for wanting climate-controlled anonymity varied from the entirely mundane to the deeply inadvisable, and the facility had never found it profitable to distinguish between these categories too precisely. Unit 402 was double-wide with reinforced steel doors and a digital keypad in the northwest corner of the property's inner ring, and Pruitt, Vance, and Dobbs arrived in 2 vehicles at 5:38 in the morning, the rain down to a drizzle. Now the sky beginning to lighten at its far eastern edge in the tentative way of a sunrise that hasn't committed yet. They used the cloned keycard at the main gate, drove to the inner ring, backed both vehicles to the door of 402. Vance punched the digital code. The steel door rolled upward with the mechanical grinding of a large, well-maintained door doing its work, and the interior of the unit was revealed in the light from the facility's overhead floods. And what was in the interior of the unit was nothing. Clean concrete floor, no pallets of shrink-wrapped currency, no stacked asset inventory, no seized Rolex collection in the fireproof cabinet in the left corner, no plastic-wrapped bundles, nothing that had been there 48 hours ago when Vance had done his last inventory check, nothing that 4 years of operation had accumulated in this space. Nothing at all, except the clean concrete floor and a single metal folding chair positioned in the exact center of the room, and on the chair a ruggedized laptop with its screen dark. Pruitt swept the room with his weapon, which was the only action available to him, because the impulse to do something when the ground disappears is so strong that even an experienced detective with a drawn gun in an empty room cannot resist it. Vance did not draw his weapon. He stood in the doorway with his hands at his sides and looked at the empty room for a long moment with the specific expression of a man whose analytical capacity has encountered a data point that it cannot integrate. Not denial, not anger, but a kind of deep structural pause the moment before the recalculation begins. Dobbs made a sound. Not a word, a sound involuntary, low the sound a man makes when the weight he has been carrying is suddenly and completely beyond him. The laptop screen came to life. No dramatic flicker, no elaborate animation, just the ordinary power-on sequence of a computer waking from sleep. A brief cascade of system indicators, and then a live camera feed showing the 3 of them standing exactly where they were standing, shot from the camera above the door at an angle that captured all 3 faces with complete clarity. And then Marcus Webb's voice through the laptop speakers without urgency, without triumph, without any quality in it except the specific quality of a man describing a situation accurately. "Good morning." Pruitt raised his weapon at the laptop. "Webb, you're a dead man," he said. "You hear me in there. You're dead." "I don't think so," Marcus said. "You made a critical error last Thursday evening, Detective Pruitt. You assumed I was a civilian." A pause. "I want to correct that assumption." And then Marcus told them what the $280,000 was FBI serialized bait. money serial numbers logged already in federal custody, and named the victims the case had documented, including Devin Sims, and walked through the RICO evidence Torres had assembled over 22 months. The ledgers, the cartel receipts, the offshore accounts, the 14 months of burner phone texts to the cartel intermediary, all of it already in the hands of the Department of Justice. The laptop screen shifted to show a document. The 43 names on that list, Marcus said, are the people you've been doing this to since 2019. Some of them lost their savings. Some of them lost their businesses. None of them had a number to call. Tonight I called it for them. Dobbs sat down on the concrete floor. He didn't look for something to sit on his knees, simply stopped functioning, and he went down, and he sat cross-legged on the concrete of the empty unit, and put his hands on his knees and looked at the floor. Federal prison, Dobbs said to no one. "We're going to federal prison." "Worse," Marcus said. "You're going to federal prison as law enforcement officers who stole cartel money. I understand the cartel has institutional relationships inside the federal penitentiary system." Pruitt raised his weapon and fired 3 shots into the laptop. The screen died in a shower of sparks, and the echo of the shots in the concrete room was enormous. And then it was gone. And the 3 men stood in the sudden silence of a room where a great deal had just ended, and the room was still empty, and nothing about it was different from what it had been a minute ago, except that the laptop was broken, and the shots had been fired, and there was now, in addition to everything else, a weapon discharge on the record. The silence lasted 4 seconds. Then, the exterior floodlights of the Apex Secure Storage Facility came on all at once. Not the facility's own overhead lights, but something external and massive, installed on temporary rigs on the facility's perimeter walls by Torres's team between 2 and 4 in the morning, turning the pre-dawn gray of the facility's interior ring into a light so hard and white and total that all 3 men raised their hands reflexively against it. Then the sirens, not from one direction, which would have allowed a calculation of route and exit from every direction, simultaneously layered and overlapping the sound of 12 FBI tactical vehicles moving in coordinated convergence on the facility from the Edgewood staging point, and 2 marked Georgia State Police units behind them for jurisdictional formality, and the combined approach sound of them all coming at once was something that registered not just in the ears, but in the chest, a physical presence. They came without announcement and without the graduated escalation of a standard approach, because Pruitt had fired a weapon inside the facility, and Torres had been waiting for exactly the kind of event that justified hard entry. And so the vehicles came fast, and they came from everywhere, and they blocked every exit point of the facility's inner ring simultaneously with the precision of a plan executed by people who had rehearsed it. Doors opened. 28 FBI SWAT agents in full tactical gear came out of the vehicles and moved to their assigned positions, and the bullhorn came on 1 second after the last agent was in place, and what it said was FBI. Weapons on the ground. Hands visible, on your knees, now. Pruitt had the smoking gun still in his hand. He looked at the laser dots from the rifle sights on his chest. Not 1, not 2, but several, dancing on his center mass from multiple directions simultaneously, and he understood with the complete clarity of a man who has spent his career on the other side of exactly this situation that there was no play left. The gun dropped. His knees hit the wet concrete. His hands went behind his head. Vance was already on the ground, face down, arms wide, the calculated surrender of a man who has determined that compliance is the only remaining variable he controls, and who has acted on that determination before his partner did. Dobbs was still sitting cross-legged on the concrete floor where he had sat down a minute ago, and 2 agents had to take him by the arms and lift him to standing before they could cuff him, and he did not resist. Did not have the structural capacity to resist. And when the handcuffs closed around his wrists, he made the sound again, the same involuntary sound as before, the sound of a man for whom the weight has finally fully landed. 3 badges came off chains and went into separate evidence bags. 3 weapons were cleared and bagged. 3 men went into separate transport vehicles, and the vehicles rolled out of the facility in the growing light of a Friday morning in August, and the sirens faded down Route 85 in 3 different directions. Marcus had been on the roof of the adjacent building since 4:50, lying prone behind the parapet wall with a civilian thermal scope he had owned for 7 years, and used primarily for deer observation on a property he leased in North Georgia and had not visited in 14 months, and which was currently serving the function for which it was originally designed, which was seeing warm objects in dark environments. He was not armed. He had not been armed at any point in the preceding 8 hours, because this was not that kind of operation, and had never been intended to be, and because Marcus understood with the clarity that comes from 20 years of work in which the difference between a sanctioned action and an unsanctioned one had enormous and permanent consequences exactly where the boundary was, and exactly how important it was not to cross it. He watched through the scope, the floodlights coming on the sudden obliteration of the pre-dawn gray, the vehicles arriving from every direction with the coordinated precision that Torres's team had spent 3 days rehearsing. Pruitt going to his knees, Vance already on the ground before the bullhorn finished its first sentence, Dobbs being lifted, the badges coming off, the transports loading. He watched until the last vehicle rolled out of the facility and the floodlights were switched back to the facility's own system, and the inner ring returned to its ordinary early morning quiet. And then he lay still for another minute, looking at the empty space where 3 men had been standing 6 minutes ago, and what he felt was not triumph and not relief, but something more complicated and quieter. The specific feeling of a man who has done something necessary, and knows with certainty that it was necessary and will not for that reason feel the need to celebrate it. His phone buzzed. Cole Clean, Sweep Marcus. Torres is calling it a complete RICO package. All 3 in federal custody, no injuries, weapon discharge on record. A pause. The FBI director's going to send you a fruit basket. Tell him to send the money instead, Marcus said. Your $280,000 is already back in your safe, Cole said. Torres had it returned at 3:30 this morning. Untouched serial numbers still on the bills. And the rest, Marcus said. Cole walked him through it. The $2.9 million had been transferred to federal evidence at 1:45. It would enter the RICO recovery process and be distributed through the victim restitution provisions of the case, which Torres had confirmed would include Devin Sims and every other documented victim, all 43 names, with the recovery process beginning as soon as the indictment was filed, 72 hours, Torres estimated. The cartel receipts were the piece she needed, Cole said. The RICO case without those was a strong misdemeanor situation. With those, it's a federal conspiracy with organized crime connections. These 3 aren't getting deals. Marcus was quiet for a moment. The informant at the credit union, he said. In Torres's pocket, now, Cole said. Cooperation agreement reduced exposure. Not 0, but reduced. Good enough, Marcus said. He stood from behind the parapet and folded the thermal scope and put it in its soft case and looked out over the city southwest Atlanta beginning to emerge from the dark. At its edges, the skyline against a sky that was moving from black to the deep blue that comes just before actual dawn, the streets below still quiet, still wet from the rain, the particular smell of a city after rain, which is the smell of a city cleaned of everything temporary. What now? Commander Cole said, using the old designation with the warmth of a man who knows when it applies. I've got a fender to finish, Marcus said. He went down the stairs. Diana Torres had been building this case for 22 months, and what that meant in practice was 22 months of financial subpoenas and informant management and surveillance logs, and the particular patience required to build a case so thoroughly that the defense cannot find the seam to pull, and when the SWAT team returned to the staging area and she received the confirmed arrest notification at 5:54 in the morning, what she felt was not celebration, but the specific relief of a structure holding weight. The evidence inventory from Unit 402 was processed at the FBI field office on Century Parkway, beginning at 7 a.m., and what the inventory confirmed was $2.9 million in currency 43 handwritten seizure ledgers in Vance's handwriting that corresponded to 43 dates over 4 years. Cartel, kickback receipts totaling $340,000 in 14 monthly payments, a burner phone with 14 months of texts to an intermediary contact identified in Torres's existing case files, and 17 pages of what appeared to be an informal operational guide for civil forfeiture, targeting the methodology Vance had developed and which Torres's team had suspected existed but had not been able to locate until now. The informal guide alone, Torres told her supervisor, was enough to open cases in 3 additional counties where she had suspected similar operations. Dobbs came apart in the interview room at 8:15 before his attorney arrived, which was not legally coerced. He was read his rights, he acknowledged them, and then he started talking because men who joined corruption for comfort find when comfort disappears completely that they have no other structure to fall back on. He gave them the cartel intermediary's name and contact information, and the location of 2 additional caches he personally knew about. He gave them the identities of 2 additional officers in the unit who had participated in seizures using Vance's methodology, both of whom Torres had suspected, but not confirmed. He gave them the name of the credit union branch manager who had approved the informant relationship that targeted Marcus, a name Torres had suspected but not had in writing until now. Pruitt held for 6 hours before his union representative appeared, reviewed the case file, and told him with the flat honesty of a man who has been in this situation before and understands when there is no version of it that is good. The union isn't absorbing this case, Conrad. This is federal. RICO. You need to make the calculation yourself. Pruitt made the calculation. He confirmed Dobbs's account in full and added 3 additional seizures he had conducted without Vance's knowledge to supplement his personal gambling debt payments. 3 victims whose names were not yet in Torres's file and who would now receive restitution notifications that Torres knew arrive with no explanation that adequately accounted for the years they had spent wondering why the system had failed them. Vance said nothing for 18 hours. He did not deny, did not confirm, did not perform remorse, did not perform defiance. He simply sat in the interview room with the stillness of a man who has processed the situation and arrived at the conclusion that silence is the only remaining position with any integrity, and he maintained it until his attorney negotiated a cooperation agreement that Torres declined twice before accepting on the 3rd version, because the information Vance could provide about the cartel-adjacent network was legitimately valuable and legitimately difficult to obtain any other way, and Torres was a pragmatist before she was a moralist. The credit union informant's cooperation agreement was finalized by noon. Torres called Marcus at 1 in the afternoon. The indictments filed, she said. 72 hours, like I said. Restitution notifications go out Monday. Devin Sims gets his first. Marcus said. That's not how the process. Torres paused. I'll make sure his is processed first. Thank you, Marcus said. The federal system moves at its own pace, which is not fast, but is when it finally arrives comprehensive in a way that local systems rarely are. And what arrived for Conrad Pruitt and Stuart Vance and Earl Dobbs over the 6 months following their arrest on a Friday morning at Apex Secure Storage was a reckoning that had the particular quality of reckoning that Marcus had hoped for, not just legal consequence, but the full weight of what they had built returned to them. Conrad Pruitt faced federal RICO charges, civil rights deprivation under color of law, aggravated assault for the 3 shots fired in the storage unit, and obstruction of justice for his attempt to manage Tanya's credit union informant through Dobbs. His union representation was withdrawn publicly, 48 hours after the arrest, the Fraternal Order of Police released a statement calling his conduct a betrayal of the oath and an embarrassment to law enforcement professionals everywhere, which was true, and also self-protective, and Marcus did not hold the self-protection against them. Teresa Pruitt filed for divorce before the first bail hearing. She had not known about the offshore structures or the gambling accounts, but she had known in the way that people know things they have decided not to examine, that the money didn't add up, and the not examining had been a choice she had made repeatedly over 6 years, and the arrest ended the possibility of continuing to make it. The house in the Windhaven development, purchased with down payment funds that could be traced through the RICO financial documentation to unit skimming proceeds, entered federal asset forfeiture proceedings within 60 days. The HOA sent a notice about the delinquent dues. Pruitt's eldest son transferred from the private school in September. At sentencing, the federal judge, the Honorable Celestine Okafor, a 61-year-old woman who had been on the federal bench for 14 years and who had heard every version of every argument for why law enforcement corruption deserved a different accounting than other crime, read the names of all 43 victims into the record before addressing Pruitt directly, and then sentenced him to 21 years in federal prison with no early release provisions, and Pruitt received this with the stillness of a man who has run out of angles and knows it. Stuart Vance received 14 years as a result of his cooperation less than Pruitt, because the information he provided was genuine and useful, more than Dobbs, because his role in designing and sustaining the operation made him in the court's finding the most culpable of the three in architectural terms. His offshore accounts, $387,000 initially routed by Marcus, and then identified in full by Torres's financial team, were recovered and placed in the Victim Restitution Fund, along with an additional $211,000 in domestic accounts identified through the RICO proceedings. Vance said nothing at sentencing, which the judge noted for the record as an absence of remorse and incorporated into the sentencing consideration. Earl Dobbs received 9 years, reduced from what his exposure would otherwise have been because of the scope and promptness of his cooperation, and he lost his pension entirely. And at his plea hearing, the judge allowed him to make a brief statement to the gallery, which Dobbs used to say 2 sentences. I knew it was wrong, and I kept telling myself I wasn't the one doing it because I wasn't the one who kicked the door in. He paused. I was. The gallery was quiet when he sat down, and the quiet held for a moment in the way that quiet holds when something true has been said. And then the proceeding continued, and the 9 years were entered into the record, and Dobbs was remanded to custody, and the stone he had been carrying for 4 years was finally fully laid down. The federal courthouse in Atlanta, on a Tuesday in late March, had the particular quality of federal courthouses in all seasons, which is the quality of gravity made architectural. The high ceilings and the marble and the long hallways that make even ordinary footsteps sound deliberate, as if the building itself is ensuring that everyone who moves through it understands that what happens here carries weight. The gallery of courtroom 7B was full, in the way that matters not with press in large numbers, though the press was present, but with the people whose presence gave the proceeding its actual meaning, which was the 43 documented victims and their family members on the left side of the gallery, and the family members of the 3 convicted men on the right, and the specific human weight of both sides present in the same room, and required to breathe the same conditioned air for the duration of a proceeding that was technically about sentencing guidelines and RICO statutes and federal mandatory minimums, but was actually in the way that these proceedings always actually are about what happened to the people. Conrad Pruitt at the defense table was unrecognizable in the specific way of a man from whom the structural supports have been removed. The physical bulk that had filled a room on Bowen Street, that had been deployed as a presence, as a message, as the embodiment of an authority that was borrowed and now fully returned, had become in 6 months of county lockup and the nutritional arithmetic of institutional food, a different quality of largeness. The largeness of a man whose weight has nowhere to go now that the momentum behind it is gone. He sat with his eyes on the table. Special Agent Torres presented the government's sentencing position, and what she did was not speechify. She recited facts in the flat, precise manner of a person who has spent 22 months with these facts and trusts them completely. And the facts she recited were 43 victims, 4 years of operation, $4.1 million in illegally seized funds, 2 additional officers whose cases were now under federal review, and the cartel-adjacent network whose financial relationship with the unit had been dismantled as a result of the case. And then she read the names. All 43 in alphabetical order, with the amount seized from each. Devin Sims was number 39, $34,000. Food truck operating capital, 14 months of recovery. The reading took 4 minutes and 15 seconds, and the courtroom was completely silent for all of it. And the silence had a quality that Marcus, sitting in the gallery, recognized from certain operations, the silence that falls when the full weight of something becomes visible, and everyone in the room understands it simultaneously. The Honorable Celestine Okafor addressed Pruitt before the sentence. She said she had presided over many cases of law enforcement misconduct in 14 years on the federal bench, and in her experience the most damaging kind was not the explosive kind, not the kind that announced itself in violence and ended quickly, but the kind that hid inside legitimate process and used the weight of institutional authority to silence its victims, the kind that worked precisely because it trusted that the people it targeted would have no effective recourse and no one who would look, and that this trust had been for 4 years correct. She looked at Pruitt. She said, "The law you used as a weapon has today been turned toward its actual purpose." 21 years, federal, no parole. Pruitt did not react. In the gallery in the second row from the back, Mrs. Loretta Sims sat in her good shoes with her hands folded in her lap because her nephew Devin could not take a Tuesday off from the food truck and someone needed to be there for the 43. She was making her way toward the elevator when Marcus caught up to her in the courthouse hallway, moving slowly in her good shoes, which were not uncomfortable but were not her everyday shoes, and she had been in them since 8 in the morning, and it was now past 3 in the afternoon. She saw him and stopped. He stopped. Between them was the specific silence of 2 people who know each other well enough that what needs to be said does not urgently need to be said aloud, and they stood in the marble hallway of the federal courthouse for a moment in that silence. And then Mrs. Sims reached into her purse for a tissue that she didn't actually need, but was the gesture available to her. And she said, "Devin got a letter from the Department of Justice 2 weeks ago." "I know," Marcus said. "Torres told me. He called me when he got it," she said. "He was at the truck. I could hear the traffic." She paused, folding the tissue. "He cried." Marcus waited. "He said it wasn't the money," she said. "He said he could have rebuilt the money eventually. He said what he couldn't do was understand why nobody looked, why he went through all of it and nobody ever looked." She pressed the tissue between her palms. That letter was somebody looking. Marcus thought about the question he had asked Torres before he agreed to cooperate, the question about Devin, about the 43 names, about whether the restitution provisions would reach them, and about the 3 seconds between Torres saying yes and him saying, "I agree," and what had been in those 3 seconds, which was not calculation but recognition. The recognition that this was the reason. The only reason that made the whole architecture of what he had done worth the weight it carried. "How's the truck doing, otherwise?" he said. Mrs. Sims looked at him for a moment. The look of a woman who has known a person in one way for a long time, and is now seeing a different dimension of them clearly for the first time. A look that contains both surprise and the recognition that the surprise should not in retrospect be a surprise. And then she smiled, which was not the polite social smile but the real one. The one she reserved for things that genuinely moved her. "He got the new refrigeration unit," she said. "Business is good." "Good," Marcus said. "You did a good thing, baby," she said. "I just made sure the right people knew where to look," he said. She nodded twice in the way that people nod when the words are sufficient, and adding to them would reduce them, and they walked together to the elevator, and she pushed the button for the lobby, and he stood beside her. And when the doors opened, she stepped in, and he followed, and they rode down in the particular comfortable quiet of two people who have in this moment nothing left that urgently needs to be said. In the lobby at the doors, she turned to him. "Come to Sunday dinner sometime," she said. "I'll cook." "I'll come," he said. And he watched her walk out through the courthouse doors into the March afternoon, taking her time in no hurry, the good shoes carrying her with more ease now than they had all morning. She came by at 7:15 that evening without calling first, which was unlike her, and Marcus knew when he heard the knock, the specific rhythm of it, the 3 knocks, and then a pause, and then one more, which was what she had done since she was 12 years old, that she had put something together. She came in, still wearing her coat, which she usually took off at the door, and she stood in his kitchen looking at him with the expression of a woman who has been processing something since approximately 2 o'clock, and has arrived at a place where she needs to say it out loud. "I saw the news coverage," she said. "The FBI corruption case, the storage facility, the task force." She paused. "Someone at school showed me the secondary piece, the one that mentioned a Bowen Street auto shop and the owner cooperating with federal investigators." Marcus set down the glass he had been holding. "Sit down," he said. She sat, coat still on. He told her all of it, starting with the side door coming off the frame on Thursday evening, and ending with the courthouse hallway that afternoon. In the same manner he told her everything, which was directly and completely, and without the embellishments that make a story sound better than it was, or the omissions that protect the teller from the full weight of what they're describing. She listened without interrupting, which was the way she listened to things that mattered, and her face moved through what he was saying, in the way that faces move through difficult material, the concentration of someone trying to hold a complex thing together long enough to understand it fully before responding to any part of it. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "There were 2 armed men in the shop with you who had already decided what they were going to do." "Yes," he said, "and you didn't call me." "You would have come," he said, "and there was nothing for you to do. That's not." She stopped, started again. "That's not why I wanted you to call me Dad." He looked at her. "I know," he said, "I should have called you." She was quiet again, and he gave her the quiet, and what moved through her face in it was not a simple thing. There was the fear, which was the fear of what could have happened, and which was entirely legitimate. And there was the anger, which was also legitimate and which Marcus accepted without arguing. And there was the third thing, the thing she couldn't name immediately, that took her a minute to identify. She said, "You did this because of Mrs. Sims's nephew." "Partly," he said, "and the others." 43, he said. She looked at her hands on the table for a moment. "You could have just," she started, and then she stopped, because she had been about to say, "You could have just gotten your money back." And she understood, as she said it, that this was precisely the point, that getting his money back was the small version of the outcome, the version that served only him, and that his father was not in any situation she had ever known him in the man who chose the small version. "Yeah," she said. She took off her coat. She found the leftovers in his refrigerator, a container of rice and a half a roast chicken and some collard greens from Sunday, and she put them in the oven, and they ate at the kitchen table at 8:30, and she told him about the classroom grant and the new books arriving on Wednesday, and the third grader who had written the story about the spaceship mechanic, and Marcus listened the way he always listened to Tanya, which was completely with the full attention of a man who considers his daughter's life to be one of the most interesting things he has access to, and they sat at the table until 10 o'clock, and then she hugged him at the door, holding on for a moment longer than usual, and he let her, and then she went home. The spring in Atlanta comes in stages, cold mornings giving way slowly to warm middays. the dogwoods appearing first at the edges of things, and then everywhere, all at once the particular quality of March light that is warm before it is hot, tentative and clean, the light of a city that has come through something and is choosing to proceed. Marcus opened the shop at 7:30, the same as every Monday, turning the lights on in the same order, overheads in the first bay, then the second, then the back office, and propping the side door open to let the morning air in, and starting the coffee maker on the workbench before he did anything else, because the crew would arrive between 7:45 and 8, and Darius in particular did not function at full capacity before the first cup. Darius arrived at 7:42, which was 8 minutes earlier than his start time, and 3 minutes earlier than he had arrived any previous Monday in 2 years of employment, and he did not say anything about this, did not explain it or draw attention to it. He just came in and picked up the coffee that Marcus had poured and ready for him, and stood for a moment looking at the second bay at the GT 500 in its primer red, and then he looked at Marcus. "She's getting there," Darius said. "She is," Marcus said. Something had shifted in Darius in the last 2 weeks, in the way that things shift in young men who are paying attention when they watch someone they respect navigate something difficult with integrity. It was not a dramatic shift, not a conversation, not a moment he could have pointed to, but it was visible in the way he carried himself in the shop, in a small increase in the quiet authority with which he approached his work, as if something had been confirmed for him about what this place was and what the people in it were capable of. Big Earl and Wendell arrived at 8:15 with 2 large coffees from the gas station on Clement that they always brought on Mondays because the shop coffee, in their long-standing and affectionate opinion, was not something that merited the Monday experience, and they came in with the easy comfort of men who have been welcome somewhere for long enough that the welcome does not require acknowledgement. They had seen the news coverage. They did not ask direct questions, because that was not how they operated. What they did, instead, was be present in the particular way of people who understand that their presence in a specific place, at a specific time, is itself a statement, and they drank their gas station coffees and watched Marcus work. And Big Earl told a story about his nephew's car trouble that took 11 minutes and required no response except occasional acknowledgement. And the shop was warm and full in the way that shops are warm and full when they are exactly what they are supposed to be. Mrs. Sims came at 9:15. She came with the foil-covered plate, the usual routine, the same side door she always used. But today she stopped in the doorway to the second bay before going to the back office, and she stood and looked at the shop. The bays, the tool walls, the GT 500, the crew at their work with the expression of a woman looking at something she is glad still exists. The look of someone who understands without needing it. Explained what it costs to keep something like this in place. Marcus took the plate. "Thank you, Mrs. Sims," he said. She patted his arm once and went home. He carried the plate to the back office and set it on the desk, and then he went to the second bay and he found the microfiber cloth on the workbench exactly where he had set it down the Thursday before last, when the tires had sounded wrong outside and the side door had taken 6 seconds to come off its frame, and a particular Thursday became something else entirely. He had not moved the cloth. It would have been wrong to move it, not wrong in any way. He could explain precisely, but wrong in the way that returning to something interrupted requires returning to it exactly the same place, the same motion, the acknowledgement that what was interrupted was real and worth returning to and has not been made lesser by what interrupted it. He picked up the cloth and returned to the left front fender panel of the 1969 Shelby GT 500 in cherry red primer, and he began the same circular motion he had been making at 6:05 on a Thursday evening 2 weeks ago. Consistent pressure, even coverage, the motion of a man at work in his own space on a Monday morning. Darius put on the Bluetooth speaker at 9:30, the jazz station, the same one Marcus used low enough to be present without demanding attention, and the sound filled the second bay and the first bay, and drifted out the open side door into the Bowen Street morning, and the shop worked. The warehouse closing happened that Friday, rescheduled from the Monday that had not gone as planned, and Marcus signed the papers with the same steady hand that had opened the floor safe for Pruitt 2 weeks before, and when the seller shook his hand across the conference table, Marcus felt the particular satisfaction of a thing completed that had been a long time in the planning, not relief exactly, but resolution, the feeling of a structure holding the weight it was built to hold. Tanya came to the closing and stood in the empty warehouse afterward, while Marcus walked her through what it was going to be, pointing to corners and walls and the back section where he planned the classroom space for the certification program. And she was quiet for a moment when he got to that part, and then she said, "Mama would have been insufferable about this," and he said, "I know." And they both smiled at the empty space that was about to become something. And the afternoon light came through the high windows at the angle that the GT500 had taught him to love, warm, patient, certain. On Bowen Street, the story traveled the way. Community stories always travel, not through news reports and press releases, but through the specific human channels of a neighborhood that has been paying attention for a long time. A reference in passing a nod between people who have been watching the same corner for years, the particular warmth that settles over a place when something has been protected that everyone understood to be worth protecting. Mrs. Sims told no one specifically what Marcus had done because she didn't need to. Her demeanor communicated it, and her demeanor had always been the most reliable information the street had access to. Darius asked Marcus once directly on a Wednesday afternoon when the shop was quiet, "Was it worth it?" Marcus did not answer immediately because the question deserved the space to be answered correctly, and when he answered he said, "Ask the 43." Darius didn't ask again. He had what he needed. 6 weeks after the Monday morning on a Saturday when the shop was closed, and Tanya was in the second bay with coffee and a book she kept setting down to watch the GT500 received its final coat, candy apple red mixed at the custom lacquer shop on Decatur Street. The color from the swatch book, Clara's color, the one she had picked before the winter of 2015, when she still had opinions about color and time, and what the car was eventually going to be. And when Marcus applied the first coat and the light hit it, that specific luminous deep red that is its own light source, he stopped for a moment and looked at it, and the moment was long enough to be what it needed to be. And then he picked up the brush and continued, and Tanya watched from the doorway without saying anything because there was nothing to say. And the shop on Bowen Street was still there, open at 7:30, closed at 6, jazz on the Bluetooth. The smell of motor oil and fresh lacquer and the specific, irreplaceable smell of work that means something. And it was going to stay there because someone had decided it would, and had made sure it did. And the morning was coming in through the high windows, the way mornings always come in when the thing that was threatened is still standing. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that quiet people are often the most powerful, and that integrity outlasts arrogance every single time, we would love to have you with us for more. Subscribe to our channel. Hit the notification bell so you never miss the next story. And if you know someone who needs to hear this one today, send it to them. Justice is not always loud, but when it arrives, it is complete. We will see you in the next one.